Marcus Cole hadn't seen his daughter this still in months. 6-year-old Lily stood frozen, mid-step on the weathered pier, her strawberry ice cream tilting dangerously in her small hand, forgotten. She was pointing toward a bench near the water's edge, where a woman sat alone, shoulders trembling, face turned toward the endless gray of the Atlantic. "Daddy," Lily whispered, tugging his sleeve with her free hand. "That's the lady who cried your name." Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He turned slowly, and when the woman lifted her head, their eyes met across 20 feet of salt-worn wood. She looked at him like she was seeing a ghost, and somehow, impossibly, he knew she recognized him. The morning had started like any other Saturday in Anchor Bay. Elena Marsh woke in her rented room above the hardware store, the kind of place that charged by the week and didn't ask questions. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, yellowed by decades of salt air, and the radiator clanked through the night like a restless ghost. But the room had a window that faced the harbor, and from her narrow bed, she could watch the fishing boats head out at dawn, their running lights blinking in the pre-morning darkness. That was enough. That was all she needed. This was her 3rd day in this small Maine fishing town, a dot on the map she'd chosen with her eyes half closed, her finger landing somewhere between nowhere and starting over. She'd done this before. Portland, Burlington, Bar Harbor, never staying longer than a few months, never unpacking more than she needed, always leaving before the walls started feeling like they belonged to her. She'd gotten good at leaving. It was the staying that had become impossible. She walked to the pier that morning because she always walked to water. There was something about the ocean that made her feel less alone in her guilt, as if the vastness of it could absorb some of what she carried. The waves didn't judge. The tide didn't ask questions. The fishing boats were already heading out, their engines humming across the still water, leaving trails of white foam in their wake. Lobster season was in full swing, and the pier smelled of brine and diesel and the honest work of people who rose before the sun. Elena sat on the bench, farthest from the ice cream stand, pulled her jacket tighter against the September wind, and watched the horizon where the gray sky met the grayer sea. She'd been doing this for 3 days, now sitting, watching, trying to feel something other than the weight that never seemed to lift. The therapists she'd seen over the years had called it depression, PTSD, survivor's guilt. She called it the thing she couldn't outrun. The laughter reached her first. A child's laughter, bright and unself-conscious, the kind that made strangers smile without meaning to. It floated across the pier like music, innocent and untroubled by the world's sharp edges. Elena didn't smile. She kept her eyes on the water, letting the sound wash over her like everything else. Children's laughter was one of the things she'd learned to tune out. It reminded her too much of what she'd lost, of the life she'd abandoned when she abandoned everything else. "Daddy, can we get the strawberry one? Please? The strawberry one with the sprinkles?" The voice was small, excited, ordinary. But the voice that answered made Elena's blood turn to ice in her veins. It wasn't the voice itself that struck her a man's voice, warm and patient, the kind of voice that belonged to a good father. It was the name that belonged to that voice, a name she'd heard spoken in the dark, on a highway shoulder, 4 years ago. A name repeated like a prayer, like a lifeline, like the last word a dying woman could form with her failing breath. "Marcus." Elena turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles went white. A man was crouching down to his daughter's level, pointing at the chalkboard menu outside the ice cream stand, completely unaware of the woman 20 feet away whose world had just collapsed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from working with his hands. His dark hair needed cutting, curling at his collar, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of grief carried quietly. His daughter had his dark hair, but someone else's eyes, warm brown eyes that Elena had never forgotten, because she'd watched them close for the last time on a cold November night. It was him. It had to be him. The universe wasn't this cruel, wasn't this precise in its cruelty. And yet, here she was, 3 days into her latest escape, and fate had delivered her directly to the one person she'd spent 4 years running from. She tried to stand. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. She tried to breathe. The air wouldn't come, and then the tears started, silent and unstoppable, streaming down her face as she watched this man, this stranger who wasn't a stranger, buy his daughter ice cream like it was just another Saturday. Like the world hadn't ended 4 years ago on a stretch of highway outside Providence. The little girl noticed first. Children always do. They haven't yet learned to look away from other people's pain, haven't yet developed the polite blindness that adults use to navigate the world's suffering. "Daddy, look." The girl tugged her father's sleeve, pointing toward Elena. "That lady is crying." Elena saw him turn. She saw his brow furrow with concern, the automatic response of a good person confronted with someone else's distress. She saw him take his daughter's hand and walk toward her, his stride purposeful but gentle, and she couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't do anything but sit there and wait for the collision she'd been dreading for 4 years. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle in a way that made something inside her crack. "Are you okay?" "My daughter said." He stopped. Something in her face must have shown, some recognition or terror or grief that didn't belong between strangers. She was shaking now, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm, and she couldn't stop looking at him like he was a wound she'd never learned to heal. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words came out broken, inadequate, nothing like the speech she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her head. "I'm so sorry." And then she ran. She pushed past him, nearly knocking the ice cream from the little girl's hand, and she ran down the pier and up the cobblestone street and didn't stop until she was back in her rented room with the door locked and her back against it, sliding down to the floor where she sat for hours, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but remember. Behind her, on the pier, Marcus Cole stood with his daughter's hand in his, watching the stranger disappear around the corner. The September wind ruffled his dark hair, and somewhere a seagull cried its mournful cry. Lily looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, her ice cream already melting in the afternoon sun, pink rivulets running down her small fingers. "Daddy, why is she sorry?" He had no answer. But the question would keep him awake for hours, turning over and over in his mind like a stone he couldn't stop touching. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table long after Lily had fallen asleep. The house was quiet, except for the distant sound of waves breaking against the rocky shore, and the old refrigerator's steady hum, sounds he'd grown so accustomed to that they'd become a kind of silence. He'd bought this place 3 years ago, a fixer-upper on the edge of town with a workshop out back where he could lose himself in the grain of reclaimed wood. The previous owner had been a boat builder who'd died without heirs, and Marcus had gotten it for a price that felt like charity. Nobody wanted to live this far from everything, this close to the cold Atlantic, this deep into nowhere. That was exactly why Marcus wanted it. Anchor Bay had seemed like the right kind of nowhere, far enough from Boston that the memories couldn't find him, small enough that he could be invisible. He'd left his job with the fire department, left his friends, left everyone who'd known Rachel, and he'd rebuilt himself here, one piece of reclaimed furniture at a time. But that woman had looked at him like she knew him, like she knew something about him that he didn't know about himself. He opened his laptop and searched for what, he wasn't sure. Her face, maybe, though he couldn't have described it beyond the tears and the terror in her eyes. Her voice, though she'd only said 5 words. He typed Anchor Bay and woman and felt ridiculous, closing the browser before the results could load. What was he going to find? What did he even want to find? Lily had asked about her 5 times before bed. The sad lady. Why was she crying? Why did she say sorry? Why did she run away? Will she come back? Marcus had deflected each question with the practiced ease of a single father who'd spent 3 years learning to redirect difficult conversations. But the truth was he didn't have answers. He only had a feeling in his chest, heavy and cold, like something was about to break open. 3 miles away, in that room above the hardware store, Elena sat on her narrow bed with her hands still shaking. 4 years. 4 years of therapy that didn't work, and medication that dulled the edges, and endless wandering that was supposed to put distance between her and that night. 4 years of waking up at 3 in the morning with a dead woman's voice in her head, her final words echoing like a prayer that was never answered. And now here she was, 10 feet from the man whose name she'd carried like a stone in her chest since she was 29 years old. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small tin box, the kind that once held mints. The lid was dented from years of handling, the paint worn away in patches where her fingers had rubbed it smooth. Inside was a folded piece of paper, soft from being opened and closed countless times, the edges worn thin as tissue. She didn't need to unfold it. She knew what it said. 2 names, written in her own handwriting on the shoulder of a highway at 11:43 at night while the sirens grew closer and a woman's hand went limp in hers. Marcus Cole. Lily. The memory flooded back, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She'd been driving to her shift at Rhode Island Hospital, the radio playing something forgettable, her mind already sorting through the cases that might be waiting. Then the headlights had caught something wrong on the shoulder ahead. An SUV, overturned, smoke rising from the crumpled hood. She'd pulled over before she'd consciously decided to, her training taking over, her hazard lights blinking in the darkness. The woman inside had been conscious, barely. Trapped by the crumpled door, bleeding from a wound Elena couldn't see in the darkness. She'd squeezed through the broken window, cutting her forearms on the jagged glass, and taken the woman's hand. "Help is coming," she'd said, the beautiful lie that medical professionals learned to tell. "You're going to be okay. Just stay with me." But the woman hadn't been okay, and Elena had known it from the moment she felt the pulse beneath her fingertips, thready, weakening, the rhythm of a heart that was losing its fight. She'd stayed anyway, holding that hand, talking about nothing and everything, keeping the woman anchored to the world for as long as she could. "Marcus," the woman had whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant sound of approaching sirens. "Tell, Marcus." "I will," Elena had promised, squeezing her hand tighter. "What do you want me to tell him?" But the woman's eyes had been closing, her grip loosening, and the only other word she managed was a name, spoken with all the love a dying mother could hold. Lily. Then the paramedics had arrived. Too late. Always too late. And Elena had stood on the highway shoulder watching them work on a body that was already gone. She'd written down the names before she forgot them, before the shock set in, before she understood that this night would reshape the entire architecture of her life. She'd meant to find them. In those first weeks after, she'd told herself she would track down this Marcus, deliver whatever message his wife had been trying to send. But the trauma had swallowed her whole, and by the time she surfaced months later, gaunt and hollow-eyed and unable to hold a scalpel without her hands shaking, the thought of facing this stranger, of explaining that she'd been there when his wife died and couldn't save her, was more than she could bear. So she'd run. She'd been running ever since. And now, fate, or chance, or some cosmic cruelty she didn't understand, had dropped her directly in his path. Elena made a decision. She would leave in the morning, pack her single bag, pay her weekly rate, and disappear to the next dot on the map. She'd gotten good at disappearing. It was the only thing she was good at anymore. But when morning came and she stepped outside with her bag over her shoulder, the first thing she saw was a little girl with dark hair and warm brown eyes, standing in front of the bakery across the street with a paper bag clutched in both hands. "It's the sad lady," Lily called out, waving with the genuine enthusiasm that only children can muster for strangers. "Daddy, it's her! It's the sad lady from yesterday." Elena couldn't run. Not this time. Not with those eyes looking at her, so innocent and unaware. She couldn't run anymore. Marcus emerged from the bakery with a paper bag in his hand, and this time he didn't let her escape. "Wait," he said, crossing the narrow street. His voice was firm but not unkind. "Please, just wait." There was something in his voice that stopped her. Not anger, not accusation, but a weariness that she recognized. The weariness of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for too long, who'd grown so accustomed to the weight that they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. He gestured toward a bench near the town's small green, a square of grass surrounded by old maple trees that were just beginning to turn gold and red. "Can we talk? Just for a minute. I'll buy you a coffee if you want." Elena shook her head. "I don't. Please." He glanced at his daughter, who was watching them both with curious intensity. "Lily, sweetheart, why don't you go inside and pick out a donut? I'll be right here where you can see me." The little girl hesitated, looking between her father and the sad lady, her small face serious with the gravity of a moment she didn't fully understand. Then she nodded and disappeared back into the bakery, pressing her face against the window to maintain surveillance. Marcus turned back to Elena. In the morning light, she could see the lines around his eyes, deeper than they should be for a man his age. She could see the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples. He looked older than she'd imagined, older than the photographs she'd seen in the news coverage 4 years ago. Grief had aged him in ways that time alone couldn't explain. "Do I know you?" he asked directly. Elena felt her throat tighten. "No, you don't." "Then why did you apologize to me?" She could lie. She could make up a story, some case of mistaken identity, some excuse that would let her walk away and keep running until she found another town where the past couldn't find her. But she'd spent 4 years lying to herself, and she was tired. So desperately tired. "You don't know me," she said slowly, each word costing her something. "But I know you, or at least, I know your name." Marcus's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something sharper. "How?" Elena looked at him, this man she'd never met but whose name had haunted her for 4 years, and she made the hardest decision of her life. "I was there," she said. "The night of the accident." The color drained from his face. His hand reached for the back of the bench, steadying himself like a man who'd just been struck. "What accident?" His voice was barely a whisper. 4 years ago, on the highway outside Providence." Elena's voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "I was driving to my shift at the hospital. I saw the car. I stopped." Marcus's hand was white-knuckled on the bench. He didn't speak, didn't breathe, didn't do anything but stare at her with eyes that had gone dark with something between hope and horror. "She was alive when I found her." Elena felt the tears coming again, hot and relentless, impossible to stop. "For 7 minutes, I stayed with her. I held her hand. No." The word came out strangled. "No. They told me they said she died on impact. She wasn't alone." Elena's voice broke completely now. "I need you to know that. She wasn't alone." Marcus stood frozen for a long moment, his face working through emotions too complex to name. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. He walked past the bakery, past his daughter's confused face pressed against the window, down the street toward the harbor where his truck was parked. Elena didn't follow. She understood. She'd just torn open a wound he'd spent 4 years pretending had healed. Lily came out of the bakery with a donut in her hand, looking after her father's retreating form. Then she looked at Elena, her small face serious. "Are you my daddy's friend?" Elena managed a sad smile. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who remembers." For 2 days, Elena didn't leave her room except to buy food from the small grocery at the end of the block. She sat by the window and watched the street below, half expecting Marcus to appear, half hoping he wouldn't. The conversation played on a loop in her head, every word she'd said, and every word she should have said instead. She should have told him everything. She should have given him the letter she'd written 3 years ago, the one she'd never been brave enough to send. She should have told him about Rachel's last words, the message his wife had desperately wanted him to receive. But the look on his face when he'd walked away, That mixture of shock and betrayal and reopened grief had silenced her. Maybe some things were better left unsaid. Maybe her presence here was already damage enough. Elena spent those 2 days remembering. She'd been a good nurse once, one of the best in the ER, they'd said. She'd handled traumas that would break most people, kept her composure when others fell apart, made life-and-death decisions with steady hands and clear eyes. But that night on the highway had been different. That night, she'd been alone with a dying woman. No equipment, no team. Nothing but her own inadequacy and a promise she couldn't keep. Rachel had asked her to do one thing. Don't let me die alone. Elena had kept that promise, at least. She'd held Rachel's hand until the end, felt the moment when her pulse stopped, watched the light leave those warm brown eyes. But it hadn't been enough. Nothing would ever be enough. Afterward, she'd gone to work and tried to pretend everything was normal. She'd lasted 6 months before the nightmares and panic attacks became too much to hide. She'd quit without notice, sold everything she owned, and started running. On the 3rd day, there was a knock at her door. Elena's heart seized. She crept to the door, pressed her eye to the peephole, and felt her breath catch. Lily stood in the hallway, a paper bag clutched in her small hands. Elena opened the door slowly, her mind racing. "Lily? What are you? Does your father know you're here?" The little girl nodded solemnly. "Daddy said you probably haven't eaten. He's still mad, but I'm not." Elena didn't know what to say. She knelt down to Lily's level, taking the bag she offered. Inside was a still warm blueberry muffin and a bottle of orange juice. "Why are you here alone?" Lily asked, looking past Elena into the sparse room with its single chair and unmade bed. The question caught Elena off guard with its simple directness. Children had a way of asking the things adults were afraid to voice. "Because sometimes," Elena said carefully, "when you run away from something, you forget how to stop." Lily considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. "My daddy runs too," she said finally. "He runs to the workshop when he's sad. He stays there for hours and hours and makes things." Elena looked at this little girl, so earnest and wise beyond her years. She had Rachel's eyes, she realized now, that same warm brown, that same particular way of looking at a person like she could see straight through to the truth they were trying to hide. "Your daddy loves you very much," Elena said softly. "I know." Lily smiled. "Mommy tells me in my dreams." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that seemed to come so easily now. "You should go back," she managed. "Your daddy will worry." Lily nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I hope you stop running soon," she said. "It sounds very tiring." Then she was gone, her small footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving Elena alone with a muffin she couldn't eat and a grief she couldn't outrun. Marcus had spent 3 days avoiding the truth. He'd worked in his shop until his hands ached, restoring a 100-year-old oak chair for a client in Portland. The wood was stubborn, the joint swollen with age, but he'd coaxed it back to life with patience and sandpaper and linseed oil. He'd lost himself in the grain, in the rhythm of restoration, in work that required just enough concentration to keep the thoughts at bay. But Lily wouldn't let him forget. She talked about the sad lady at breakfast and dinner and bedtime. She asked questions he couldn't answer and made observations that cut too close to the bone. And finally, she'd taken matters into her own small hands and delivered food to the woman who'd shattered his carefully constructed denial. That night, after Lily was asleep, Marcus did something he'd been avoiding for 4 years. He went to the back of his closet and pulled out the box. It was a simple cardboard box, the kind you'd use for moving, sealed with packing tape he'd never broken. Inside were Rachel's things. Not all of them. He'd donated her clothes, sold her car, given her jewelry to her mother. But the personal things, the important things, he'd packed away and brought with him from Boston. Her journals, her photographs, the police report. He'd requested it from the Boston PD 6 months after the accident and immediately shoved it in this box, unread. He'd told himself he wasn't ready. Then he'd told himself it didn't matter anymore. Then he'd stopped thinking about it altogether. But now there was a woman in town who'd been there, who'd held his wife's hand while she died, and Marcus couldn't hide from it anymore. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. The documents inside smelled faintly of dust and old paper. He shuffled through them until he found the accident report, its clinical language so at odds with the magnitude of what it described. He read slowly, forcing himself to absorb every word. Time of accident, location, conditions, cause. And then, in a section he'd never known existed, a witness statement. Elena Marsh, age 29, registered nurse at Rhode Island Hospital. Miss Marsh was traveling southbound when she observed the overturned vehicle on the shoulder. She stopped to render assistance and remained with the victim until emergency services arrived. Miss Marsh reported that the victim was conscious but critically injured. The victim expired approximately 7 minutes after Miss Marsh's arrival. Marcus read the sentence again, and again, and again. The witness remained with the victim, holding her hand. For 4 years, he'd imagined Rachel's final moments alone. On a dark highway, in an overturned car, frightened and hurt, and waiting for help that came too late. It was the nightmare that had driven him from Boston, from his job as a firefighter, from everyone who'd known them together. The thought that she'd died alone was the thing he couldn't bear. But she hadn't. Someone had been there. Someone had stopped when they didn't have to, had crawled through broken glass, had held his wife's hand when he couldn't be there to hold it himself. Elena Marsh had stopped. Marcus put down the report. He covered his face with his hands, and for the first time since Rachel's funeral, he wept. Not the silent, controlled tears he'd allowed himself at night when Lily couldn't hear. Real tears, the kind that shook his whole body and left him gasping. He was still sitting there when Lily padded into the workshop in her pajamas, drawn by some childish intuition that her father needed her. She didn't say anything, just climbed into his lap and wrapped her small arms around his neck, holding him the way he'd held her through countless nightmares. "It's okay, Daddy," she said. "Mommy's watching us from the stars, remember?" Marcus held his daughter tighter than he had in years and made a decision. He needed to see Elena again. Elena was packing. Again. The familiar motions of folding clothes and zipping bags, of erasing her presence from another temporary room. She'd gotten good at this. Too good. The knock at the door stopped her mid-fold. She knew who it was before she opened it. She'd been waiting for this, dreading it, and hoping for it in equal measure. Marcus stood in the hallway, his face drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with ghosts and lost. "I read the report," he said. For the first time, Elena nodded slowly. "I figured you might. You stayed with her." His voice caught. "I didn't know anyone stayed with her." There was a long silence. Elena didn't know what to say, how to navigate this conversation she'd imagined 1,000 times and never got right. "Would you like to come in?" she finally asked. Her room was small and bare, the furniture sparse, the walls empty. Marcus sat in the single chair by the window, while Elena perched on the edge of the bed. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the worn wooden floor. "Tell me," Marcus said. "Tell me everything." So Elena did. She told him about seeing the headlights, about pulling over, about running to the overturned car while calling 911. She told him about finding Rachel trapped inside, about squeezing through the broken window to hold her hand. She told him about the 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours, about talking to Rachel to keep her calm, about promising things she knew she couldn't deliver. "Was she in pain?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "No," Elena said, and meant it. "Not at the end. She was peaceful. She held my hand, and she looked at me, and she wasn't afraid." Marcus closed his eyes. A tear escaped down his cheek. She spoke, Elena continued. She said your name. Over and over. Marcus. Tell Marcus. Tell me what? Elena rose and walked to the small dresser where her bag sat half-packed. She reached into the side pocket and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age, never opened, never sent. I wrote you a letter, she said, 3 years ago. I meant to send it, but I couldn't. I was afraid. She held it out to him. Marcus looked at it like it might burn him. It has everything she told me, everything I remember. Elena's voice trembled. You can read it when you're ready. Marcus took the envelope. His name was written on the front in careful handwriting, the address his old apartment in Boston. Why didn't you send it? He asked. Because I was afraid you'd hate me. The words came out barely a whisper. For not saving her. For being there and not being enough. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd been carrying his wife's final moments for 4 years, who'd been crushed by a guilt she didn't deserve. He stood up, the letter in his hand. At the door, he paused and turned back. I could never hate someone who held my wife's hand when she died. Then he was gone, leaving Elena alone with the silence and the slowly setting sun. Marcus waited until Lily was asleep before he could bring himself to open the envelope. He sat in his workshop surrounded by the tools and sawdust and half-finished projects that had become his refuge. The letter felt impossibly heavy in his hands. It took him 30 minutes to unseal it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in the same careful handwriting as the address. Elena's words spilled across the pages, a confession and an apology and a testimony all in one. She wrote about finding Rachel, about the fear in her own heart and the strange calm that settled over her as she realized she was the only help that was coming in time. She wrote about holding Rachel's hand through the shattered window, about feeling the fading pulse beneath her fingertips, about talking about nothing and everything just to keep the silence at bay. She wrote about Rachel's last words. Your wife talked about you constantly, Elena had written. Your name was like a talisman to her, something that kept her tethered to the world when everything else was slipping away. She said Marcus over and over, and then Lily, and I could see how much she loved you both. It was in everything, she said, even when she could barely speak. Marcus had to stop reading. The tears were coming too fast, blurring the words on the page. He forced himself to continue. Toward the end, Rachel became very clear, very focused. She grabbed my hand tighter and looked directly at me, and she said, Tell Marcus, I'm sorry I couldn't wait for him. And then she said the words I've never forgotten. Tell him to live. Tell him Lily needs him to live. Promise me. I promised her. I held her hand and I promised. And then she closed her eyes, and she was gone. Marcus couldn't read anymore. The letter slipped from his fingers and drifted to the sawdust-covered floor. He bent forward, his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands, and he sobbed. 4 years of grief he'd never fully felt. 4 years of running from a loss too enormous to face. 4 years of building walls and maintaining distance and calling it strength when it was really just fear. Rachel hadn't blamed him. Her last thoughts hadn't been of anger or regret, or the time they'd wasted arguing about things that didn't matter. Her last words had been about him, about Lily, about wanting them to live. And what had he done? He'd retreated. He'd sealed himself away. He'd held Lily at arm's length, even while holding her close, terrified that loving her fully would mean losing her too. Tell him to live. He hadn't been living. He'd been surviving, and there was a difference he was only now beginning to understand. The sound of small footsteps made him look up. Lily stood in the doorway, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm, her eyes heavy with sleep. Daddy? Bad dream? Marcus wiped his face quickly, but there was no hiding the evidence of his tears. No, sweetheart. Daddy just needed to cry. Lily padded across the workshop and climbed into his lap without hesitation. She was getting too big for this, all long limbs and growing weight, but she fit perfectly against his chest like she always had. "It's okay," she said, patting his shoulder with the automatic comfort of a child who'd learned too young how to soothe. "Mommy cries too sometimes. In my dreams, she cries when she misses us." Marcus held his daughter tighter than he had in months, maybe years. He held her like Rachel had asked him to, like a man choosing life instead of just enduring it. "I miss her too," he whispered into Lily's hair. "I miss her every day." "I know, Daddy." Lily's voice was drowsy now, sleep pulling her back under. "That's how you know you loved her." They stayed like that for a long time, father and daughter, grief and love intertwined in the quiet of the workshop. The next morning, Marcus dropped Lily at school and drove straight to Elena's building. He didn't call ahead. He was afraid that if he gave her warning, she'd be gone before he arrived. The door to her room was open. Inside, he could see her packing, just as he'd feared. "You're leaving?" Elena didn't startle, didn't turn around. She'd been expecting him. "I thought it would be easier, for both of us." Marcus stepped into the room. It looked even barer than yesterday, her few possessions already condensed into a single worn bag. "You kept a promise to my wife for 4 years, he said. "You carried her last words when I wasn't strong enough to look for them." He paused, gathering himself. "And you think leaving would be easier?" Elena's hand stilled on her bag. She didn't turn around. "I've spent 4 years with those words in my head," she said quietly. "Tell him to live. Every night, I wonder if I did enough. If I said enough, if there was something, anything, I could have done differently." You held her hand. Marcus's voice was rough with emotion. "Do you understand what that means to me? For 4 years, I thought she died alone on a dark highway. That image was destroying me. And now I know she had someone. She had you." Elena finally turned. Her eyes were red, her face pale with exhaustion and grief that had never properly healed. "I couldn't save her," she whispered. "I'm a nurse. I trained for emergencies, and I couldn't do anything. You were there." That was everything. Marcus took a step closer. Rachel chose her last words carefully. She could have said anything, asked for anything, and she chose to send a message to me and Lily. She gave those words to you because she trusted you to carry them. I almost didn't. Elena's voice broke. I almost never came. I almost let myself disappear again. But you didn't. You stayed. You're still here. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 4 years of separate grief, finally finding a meeting point. "What do you need?" Elena asked finally. "What can I do?" Marcus thought about it. About the letter, about Rachel's words, about the promise Elena had kept. "Stay," he said. "Just for a while." "Lily," he stopped, collected himself. "Lily hasn't had anyone besides me. And I haven't been enough. I've been so busy protecting myself that I forgot she needed more." Elena looked at him, really looked, and saw the same weariness she felt, the same grief, the same desperate hope that maybe, somehow, the worst of it could be behind them. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be part of anything anymore." "Neither do I." Marcus almost smiled. "Maybe we can figure it out together." That afternoon, Elena walked with Marcus to pick up Lily from school. The little girl spotted them from across the playground and came running, her backpack bouncing, her face split with a grin. She hugged her father first, then looked up at Elena with curious eyes. "Are you staying?" she asked directly. Elena looked at Marcus, who nodded slightly. "For a while," Elena said, "if that's okay with you." Lily considered this with the seriousness of a judge. "Can you come to dinner?" "Daddy's making spaghetti. He's not very good at it, but I put extra cheese on top so it's okay." Elena laughed. A real laugh. The first one in longer than she could remember. "I'd like that." They walked home together, the 3 of them, through the quiet streets of Anchor Bay. Lily held her father's hand and chattered about her day, a spelling test, A funny thing her friend said, a bird she'd seen at recess. Normal things. Beautiful things. As they passed the pier where everything had started, Lily looked up at Elena. "Did you know my mommy?" Elena felt her breath catch. She looked at Marcus, who gave her a small nod. "I met her once," Elena said carefully. "She told me she loved you and your daddy very much." Lily smiled, unsurprised. "I know. She tells me in my dreams." The sun was setting over the harbor, painting the water gold and rose. Elena watched Marcus watch his daughter, saw the love and loss and hope all tangled together on his face. They weren't healed. Not yet, maybe not ever completely, but for the first time in 4 years, none of them were alone. 6 weeks later, Elena was still in Anchor Bay. She'd moved out of the room above the hardware store and into a small cottage near the pier. Nothing fancy, just 1 bedroom and a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, but it was hers. She'd signed a 6-month lease, the longest commitment she'd made to any place since leaving Providence. She'd also started volunteering at the community health clinic 3 days a week. Not as a nurse, not yet. She wasn't ready to hold that kind of responsibility again, but she answered phones and organized files, and sometimes held the hand of an anxious patient waiting for test results. Baby steps. She was learning that baby steps still counted. Marcus had started opening Rachel's boxes, one at a time, slowly, with Lily beside him. They'd look at photographs and laugh at old memories, and sometimes Marcus would have to stop and collect himself, but he didn't pack the boxes away again. He left them open, integrated them into their home, made Rachel present instead of preserved. Lily was drawing more. Her pictures had always featured 2 figures, herself and her father, isolated on blank white paper. Now there were 3 figures, sometimes 4. A house, a pier, a boat on the water. And always, in the corner of the sky, a small yellow star. "That's Mommy," she'd explain to anyone who asked. "She watches us." On a Tuesday afternoon in October, Elena walked to Marcus's workshop carrying an old lamp she'd found at a yard sale. The brass was tarnished and the wiring was shot, but she'd seen the craftsmanship beneath the neglect. "Think you can fix it?" she asked, setting it on his workbench. Marcus examined it with the careful attention he gave everything. "Probably. Might take some time. I'm not going anywhere." He looked up at her, and something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever. They were both too broken for that, still learning how to be whole again. But something. Understanding. Companionship. The beginning of something that might, given time, become more. Lily burst through the workshop door, home from school, her backpack already discarded somewhere in the house. "Elena." She launched herself at Elena with the uncomplicated affection children give so freely. "Are you staying for dinner? Daddy's making chili. He's better at chili. I think I can stay." Marcus watched them together, his daughter and this woman who'd been there at the worst moment and somehow emerged as a gift. He wasn't sure what to call what they were becoming. Family seemed too presumptuous. Friends seemed too small. Maybe they didn't need a name. Maybe they just needed time. Later, as the sun set and they ate chili around Marcus's small kitchen table, Lily announced that she had something to show them. She ran to her room and came back with a piece of paper, holding it up with pride. It was her latest drawing. A house with a red door, a pier extending into blue water, 3 figures standing together, a tall man, a smaller woman, and a child between them. And in the corner of the sky, a yellow star. "That's us," Lily explained, pointing to each figure. "That's Daddy, that's Elena, that's me." She pointed to the star. "And that's Mommy. She's watching us." Marcus looked at Elena across the table. She met his eyes, and he saw the tears she was trying not to shed. Happy tears, maybe, or sad tears, or both. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly. "You can keep it," Lily decided, "for your new house, so Mommy can watch you there too." Elena took the drawing with careful hands, like it was something precious. Because it was. After dinner, after Lily had been tucked into bed with her bear and her nightlight, Marcus walked Elena to the door. They stood on the porch in the cool October air, neither quite ready to say goodnight. "She would have liked you," Marcus said finally. "Rachel." Elena didn't answer right away. She looked out at the darkness, at the stars just beginning to appear, at the endless ocean she could hear, but not see. "I think she did like me," she said quietly. "In those 7 minutes, I think we understood each other." Marcus nodded. He understood too. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "Same time tomorrow." Elena walked home through the quiet streets of Anchor Bay, Lily's drawing tucked carefully against her chest. The cottage was dark when she arrived, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like waiting, like the pause between one chapter ending and another beginning. She taped the drawing to her refrigerator, right at eye level where she'd see it every morning. The yellow star seemed to glow in the kitchen light. "Thank you," she whispered to the star, to Rachel, to the strange and terrible grace that had brought her here. "I'll take care of them. I promise." She'd made that promise once before, on a dark highway 4 years ago, and she'd thought she'd failed. Now she understood. Promises weren't kept in single moments, they were kept in all the moments after. Outside her window, the ocean kept its endless rhythm. Inside, Elena Marsh finally stopped running. And somewhere, watching from the stars, Rachel Cole smiled.